I wanted to welcome you to Navaja's April Lunch and Learn. We're having a General Assembly legislative wrap up, which we might want to call a in progress or on hold. And we'll get into those reasons in a little bit. My name is Alice Hogan. I'm the director of the Arlington Housing Alliance of Navaja. I was with Alliance for Housing Solutions. We recently merged with Navaja. And I'm joined by my colleague, Hannah Matuda, and she is the Director of Policy and Programs at Navaja. And we are without Jill today because she is having a very much deserved vacation. So we will proceed in her absence. I'll just tell you a little bit about the Alliance and then Isabel, and we'll hand it over to her for her presentation. So the Virginia Housing Alliance advocates for the expansion of housing opportunities and ending homelessness throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it's the only statewide voice on affordable housing and homelessness. It supports its members and clients through advocacy, education, and capacity building. And Isabel has been with VHA as their Director of Policy and Advocacy for a little over a year. And prior to VHA, she was a research and policy analyst at Housing Opportunities Made Equal home of Virginia. Prior to that, she was a homeless persons representation project outreach worker, and she worked for several years as a case manager there. Isabel holds a master's in social work from UMBC with a focus on community action and social policy. Welcome, Isabel, and we'll move to her presentation for about 30 or 35 minutes, and then we'll hopefully allow 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. We welcome participants to add their questions to the chat. We may not get to all of them, and we do have many that folks submitted during their registration process, so we have plenty of questions, but feel free to add yours. And also, if you feel comfortable, leave your camera on so we can be a community of learners together, but we would ask you to mute until the appropriate time, or if not, then through the presentation. Navaja will be sharing the slides and some additional resources in our follow-up email in the coming days, so you can watch for that. And I'd like to welcome Isabel to join us with her presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here today and get the opportunity to talk with you all about what happened so far during this year's General Assembly. So yeah, as Alice said, my name is Isabel McLean, and I'm the director here of Policy and Advocacy at the Virginia Housing Alliance. I'm excited to share about housing-related developments this year. Firstly, I'm going to provide some context for where we legislative process. I know some of you on this call may already be aware of all of this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to go into an overview of housing-related legislation that was successfully passed so far this General Assembly, prioritizing, going into more detail about that so everyone knows what will become law this summer on July 1st. Then I will also go into an update of housing-related funding levels currently on the table for ongoing budget negotiations. And then I will highlight a few priority items, maybe I can call them honorable mentions, that did not make it this session, but are still in progress. And I'll kind of offer a few potential opportunities to advocate for these. And then, of course, we will end with time for questions. Alrighty. So on this slide, you will see a general timeline of important dates regarding our state legislative process. Technically, the 2024 General Assembly adjourned on March 9th, as you'll see here, but the work was far from over at that point. Basically, whatever bills passed out of the General Assembly and the version of the budget that passed was communicated to the governor at that point, and he had 30 days to take action on those items. Technically, that deadline was April 8th this year. And by action, that means signing bills, letting bills pass into law without his signature, offering amendments to them, or vetoing bills, and also the budget as well, budget items. On April 8th, he announced all of his actions, which interestingly included a record number of vetoes for any governor of Virginia, as well as a record number of recommendations to the budget. If I'm remembering the number correctly, I think it was 223 recommendations, which was kind of a lot for everyone to process. On April 17th, last week, all of the legislature returned for what's called the reconvened session, where they respond to the governor's actions, to the amendments he offered, the vetoes, things like that. The legislature voted to reject all of the 223 recommendations that the governor had for the budget. But both the governor and the legislature committed to continuing budget negotiations. So they delayed the process, but they've committed to seeking a new budget, a new compromise over the next month. The governor has scheduled a special session calling all the legislators to come back to vote on whatever this compromise budget will end up being on May 15th. So we do not yet know what housing related items will be in our state budget. And so that's why Alice earlier kind of mentioned this is a little bit in progress. There are still some things in development. Of course, they do need to figure out a budget at the very least by July 1st, which is the start of the next fiscal year, to avoid any sort of funding issues. And also that is the date too that all new bills passed this General Assembly officially become law. All right, so now that we understand the context of where we are, I'll dive into specifics about the impact of this session on housing policy. I will say that while this session was not as successful for housing policy as we had hoped, there was still some significant victories, and most importantly, quite a lot of momentum built. So there's a lot of hope, a lot of work done, even if it may not look like an actual bill that will become law. Okay, so I have divided these into categories for ease of understanding. The first group here is two bills specifically related to manufactured home parks and manufactured home communities. The first one is a bill that was introduced by Delegate Delaney and Senator Hashmi to strengthen the Manufactured Home Lot Rental Act, which is our section of Virginia code relating to the rights of manufactured home park residents and owners. It clarified some confusing language and added some extra protections to tenants that, in many ways brought it up to line with the Virginia Landlord Tenant Act. This portion of code had been written over several years, and so there is some cleanup that needed to be done. Specifically, this bill added a limit to the late fees that owners can charge tenants for unpaid rent. It explicitly grants tenants a right of redemption, which basically means that if you are facing eviction for unpaid rent, you have the right to pay all that you owe to stop an eviction up to, when the sheriff is going to show up at your door and evict you. If you're able to pay that off at any time during that period, up to 48 hours, you are able to stop that eviction. So just clarifying that tenants of manufactured home communities also have that right in addition to tenants as specified in the Virginia Landlord Tenant Act. There were a couple other tweaks to language, clarifying the reasons that an eviction could happen and things like that. This other bill here, I will say that Delegate Krzyk initially introduced it as a much larger bill with some provisions to try to preserve and protect affordable, the affordable homes in manufactured home park communities and try to prevent displacement of residents. I can go into more details later if you all would like that during the question section, but essentially it was amended and only a smaller section of it ended up being passed, but it's still an important piece of progress. So it specifically relates to the relocation expenses that an owner is required to cover for residents that are facing a termination of their lease because the owner has sold the park to a buyer who plans to redevelop the park or change its use. In current code, owners had to cover $2,500 or $3,500 for those in Planning District 8. And it was specifically specified just for the removal of a manufactured home from that park, which can be very difficult to do because these homes are not actually mobile. But what this bill does is that it increases that to $5,000 across the board, and it no longer specifies that those funds have to just be used for the removal of a home, but they can be just for, any sort of relocation. If that individual just wants to start over somewhere else and it's too expensive to move that home, they can do that. All right, there are 3 bills related to eviction prevention that I wanted to mention today. The first one is pretty exciting. Currently, before this General Assembly, we had provisions in our code that said that a tenant could petition or request for a dismissed eviction or an unsuited or non-suited eviction case to be just expunged from their record after a certain time period, but it was still on the individual to request that and start that process, which, was great in many situations, but a lot of people didn't know about this, didn't know how to do this. And as we know, an eviction on someone's record can have significant and long-lasting impacts on their ability to find housing. So this essentially sets up an automatic process for that based on a timeline for each of these. If the case was dismissed or non-suited, that those do not remain on your record automatically. The next one is a little bit more complicated. It's also introduced by Delegate Hope. He introduced both of these. It's specifically related to a tenant's right to due process during an eviction case. So it's clarifying that a landlord or housing provider must notify a tenant or the defendant in a case if they intend to increase the amount of money that they're requesting or the amount of money that they say they're owed for the eviction, and they have to also specify exactly how much they're going to increase that by. So just to make sure that the defendant is aware always of exactly how much they owe. And then lastly, this was a bill here introduced by Delegate Coiner and Senator Locke. It also came out of the Virginia Housing Commission. They endorsed this bill. It basically extends the expiration of the eviction diversion pilot program, which was going to expire this year and has postponed that to next year. Basically to give legislators some more time to review this pilot, find if there's any reforms they need to make, and continue discussing how we can move this from something that's a pilot to something more permanent. To give a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with this, it's a small pilot, specifically only active right now in the general district courts of Danville, Hampton, Petersburg, and Richmond. So not in Northern Virginia. It doesn't come with any specific funding, but it's basically a program that helps tenants, especially low-income tenants who they're not able to pay rent because they're experiencing a one-time emergency, they've just lost their job, there's a medical bill, etc. It helps them get onto a payment plan so that they are able to, divert from that eviction and get on a payment plan that's something reasonable that they could be able to recover, since this is just a, one-time sort of emergency instead of actually being evicted. So they are wanting to do some work to see if that can be expanded. I'll mention one other kind of tenant protection bill that passed we're excited about. This was introduced by Delegate Delaney. I know that she also introduced it last year as well, but this year it passed. Basically, it's related to the situations in which a victim of domestic violence, sexual abuse, or other forms of sexual assault can terminate a rental agreement early. for their safety for many different reasons. Currently under our code, they have to have a family abuse protective order or a conviction. Those are kind of the things that allow them, to prove their situation and be able to terminate without penalties. Delegate Delaney wanted to expand that because it can definitely be, hard or almost too late if you have to wait till a conviction to be able to terminate and move if you need to. And so this kind of expands a little bit and says that you have to just have a permanent protective order. And then you do, of course, have to still give proper written notice. So that passed this year. And then there's two interesting bills related to building code standards, which are not usually legislated at the state level, but there are things that we can do at the state level to try to improve and provide coordination around them. So this first one, basically, it's kind of where the state can come in on this. By allowing localities to charge or impose higher fines against repeat offenders of the Uniform Statewide Building Code, basically giving them some more leverage to be able to enforce code violations against, what we often think of slumlords or kind of bad actors in the residential space that are not addressing code violations and are continuing to offend there. So that has passed. And then this other bill is actually a study bill. It's kind of interesting. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, but essentially it sets up an advisory group to evaluate our current building code and suggest changes related to potentially permitting the use of single exit stairways for residential buildings that are under 6 stories or less. So it's a little bit complicated. So currently in our code, residential buildings that are 3 stories or higher have to have 2 exit stairways. There's a lot of, I guess, different reasons for that. But there's been a lot of research and a lot of comparisons to other places across the world, other places in the United States, in history when this maybe wasn't required, where this might not be as necessary, and it could be kind of a barrier to creating more dense housing that, maybe instead of having the stairway, if we don't need it, we could have more units. So it's definitely something that they want to study. The legislator did not actually pass any sort of suggestions for this, but to bring everyone together, all the stakeholders, including, fire safety personnel as well, to kind of talk through how they can do this responsibly. But the intent behind it is to try to potentially remove a unnecessary barrier to allow for more dense and diverse housing. Delegate Willett introduced a bill this year related to a program we have called the Community of Opportunity Tax Credit. This is administered by DHCD, and it's been around for a couple years now. It was originally something that was only applicable in Richmond, but it's expanded now across the state. Essentially, it is a pool of tax credits that landlords who rent to housing choice voucher holders, specifically in properties that are in areas of high opportunity, which is defined as census tracts with 10% or lower poverty rate, that they might qualify for this tax credit, sort of as an incentive for landlords to pursue and house housing choice voucher holders who often have a very difficult time finding housing that they can secure. And also it's providing kind of an incentive to ensure that the actual housing choice voucher program achieves some of its goals, which was to increase housing opportunity and housing choice. So currently, this tax credit was capped at $250,000 a year. That was kind of the available pool. This bill has doubled that to $500,000 a year. And it has also set aside a portion, I believe about $100,000 of that for landlords in more rural areas who have not been able to really take advantage of this in the past. This has really largely been those in metropolitan areas. So they wanted to have a little bit of an earmark, kind of a pilot to ensure that this could apply and could work in non-metropolitan areas as well across Virginia. These are the last two bills that I will mention that passed this session. I will say that this is not an entirely exhaustive list. There are definitely some other bills related to housing that were on the table, but I didn't want to hold you all for an hour and a half or 2 hours. So I tried to pick some of the most important or most relevant ones. So I'll end with these two. These are related to funds for affordable housing, but I did want to clarify by me putting unfunded funds that these are not budget items or things that needed to be funded with a budget. They're specifically related to providing more funding opportunities for localities to take advantage of. So this first one is another study bill. It's setting up a work group to study and kind of come up with a plan or figure out the feasibility of having a Virginia Residential Development Infrastructure Fund. So this would be a separate fund that can be used to cover some of the expensive infrastructure needs when developing new housing that can cause costs to rise and keep some of the residential units from being affordable. So it can definitely cut down on some of those costs and make sure that remove any barriers to the development of affordable housing and housing in general. So they're going to be a gathering this year and studying that. That was introduced by Senator Carol Foy. I realize that I have not been doing a great job of citing which patrons actually introduced each of these bills. They are mentioned in here. So I just wanted to make sure that you all are aware who actually introduced and who did the work on these and these bills. And the last one here introduced by Delegate Coyner and Senator Locke. Again, this was another bill that was endorsed by the Housing Commission. It's basically allowing all localities, not just Richmond. That's currently only Richmond is really given this authority, but it's what are called community revitalization funds, which in the language of the code basically are kind of funds that localities can use to prevent neighborhood deterioration. So it's stuff like residential development, infrastructure development, redevelopment, rehab, preservation. It can be kind of loosely applied. From what I know of how it's been used in Richmond, that I think it's kind of been set up as similar to Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but not quite what you all are used to in Northern Virginia, because it's not through, not also set up and reinforced with an affordable dwelling unit ordinance. But this is kind of a flexible fund. So this is just saying that any locality can set something like this up if they would like to. All righty. So moving on to our state budget that is not fully finalized yet. I have a chart here to show you all that I hope kind of gives a lay of the land about where we are right now and what's still on the table. So right here we list out several different housing related programs, kind of budget line items that were included in the conference report, like basically the budget that both the House and the Senate approved and voted out of the General Assembly and communicated to the governor. So that is what you'll see here in the FY25 and FY26 General Assembly columns. And then it also includes, based on what the governor had recommended on April 8th for FY25 and FY26. So this is kind of where they're negotiating right now, kind of moving back to the version of the budget they first communicated to the governor. But to be honest, I don't know exactly what's still, to all the details for what's on the table and what those conversations are about right now. But these are kind of some best guesses to provide some context. So right now, the Virginia Housing Trust Fund seems to be in a good place. The final version of the budget from the General Assembly included a $12.5 million increase each year, which would bring investment in the trust fund to 175 million total over the biennium, which is the highest level that it's ever been funded at. The governor included that in his recommendations. He did not recommend changing that. So, so that's why you see 12.5 million across the board there. In addition, the budget included $675,000 for continuum of care lead agencies. These are our statewide kind of our state agencies that coordinate homeless service and homeless services and homeless prevention, coordinating, program funding and the provision of those services. Our baseline state investments in homeless services and homeless prevention have not increased in the past 10 years. A lot of that funding comes from the federal government, but what the state contributes hasn't increased in a long time. And so this would add to that and specify that this funding is for capacity building, because a lot of the other forms of funding that these agencies receive, can be restricted to programs or different things, and oftentimes not left with a lot of money for capacity building. So this specifically would provide a little bit of money available to them for that purpose. And again, it was the governor did not recommend changing that from the budget. The remaining things did include some changes from the governor's recommendations. For example, in the General Assembly conference report, there were two programs, two kind of like pilot programs that got some initial funding for FY25. The first is a kind of a down payment assistance program for very low wage families to help expand homeownership opportunities. It would have received $5 million. Specifically, this money was kind of taken from, it can get kind of more complicated. I won't go into a ton of detail, but this was specifically from unallocated funds from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which was a little surprising. We weren't expecting necessarily to have funding from there for different housing initiatives, but a creative idea to try to make this happen. That was also the same case for another new program called the Manufactured Home Acquisition Fund, or Revolving Loan Fund, specifically set up to help nonprofits, be able to purchase and preserve manufactured home parks, help residents purchase the land under which their homes reside. And again, $5 million just for the first year, and from unallocated RGGI, or Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative funds. The governor recommended removing those. And I do know that there are, bigger context with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in general that may have complicated things as well. But that's kind of where we are with those. And then in addition, the conference report included an increase of $3 million for our permanent supportive housing program, as well as our what's called the State Rental Assistance Program, or SRAP. Both of these programs are administered by DBHDS, and they provide housing assistance to individuals with disabilities. Specifically, the Permanent Supportive Housing Program provides rental assistance and coordinates services for adults with serious mental illnesses, with a priority for those exiting hospitals and higher institutions of care. And then the State Rental Assistance Program is rental assistance, kind of like vouchers, specifically for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Both of these programs are incredibly important and successful. They do a lot of really good work. And they also are kind of part of some of our general efforts in Virginia related to the Department of Justice settlement case regarding providing more community-based housing opportunities for individuals with disabilities instead of, disproportionately institutionalizing individuals with disabilities. And so these are really important programs that need increased investments each year to keep up with raising housing costs, ensure that we're still serving at the very least the same amount of individuals that we currently are. And unfortunately, the governor recommended removing the increase to permanent supportive housing. It's still, we did receive quite a large increase last year, so there is still some progress being made, but unfortunately not continuing that for this year. And then he also recommended cutting in half the increase to the state rental assistance program. So instead of an increase of 1 million, it would just be 500,000, which is definitely better than nothing, but still is not enough to ensure that the program is able to serve the same amount of individuals and it fund the same amount of vouchers as they currently are. So that's kind of where we are with those at the moment. And then lastly, we have the Virginia Eviction Reduction Program, which this is different than the diversion pilot program I mentioned earlier, which I know can be a little bit confusing. I've definitely mixed up those programs before, but this one does come with money. It's specifically a program that's set up to kind of collaborate with local agencies that like different kind of organizations that serve their local area to provide kind of eviction prevention funds, emergency kind of funds to try to, again, prevent evictions. It is kind of a last, maybe like a last solution. You do have to already have an eviction date and things like that. I don't need to go into details, but it is a small program that we do have for eviction prevention. The conference report included a increase of 150,000, which would have brought us to a little over like almost 3.5 million each year for this. But that increase was not recommended by the governor. So again, I can't predict what will happen. These things could look totally different when we see the final budget, but it is helpful to at least kind of know what has been decided, what has been announced, to form a better idea of a little bit about what's on the table. But because we have about a month, maybe a little less than a month, until legislators must vote on this, or they come back to vote if there's a bill that has been decided, there is more time to advocate for some of those housing programs to be funded in the budget. We want to make sure that that the pressure still remains, that housing still remains people's minds as a priority. It's really important that we don't look to housing as one of the first things in the budget to cut when it's a tight year, but that it is treated as a priority. And so there is an opportunity if you wanted to send emails to some of the key budget negotiators. So these are the conferees, those who are appointed by the House and the Senate to kind of negotiate on their behalf. There's 6 from each chamber. And they are kind of the lead negotiators working with the governor. You can also reach out to the governor. I did put a link here in the slides, and I can also put it in the chat. Let me pull that up. I think it is this one. We have kind of a spreadsheet, a Google spreadsheet that lists out all of the budget conferees, their information and their email for your convenience, especially if you live in any of the districts of those who are the conferees, if they are your representative. They definitely encourage you to reach out to them, and you can mention any of the things that were listed in that chart. Tell stories about why housing in general needs to be a priority for funding. If you would like more support with that, I can share some materials, but we'll definitely follow up afterwards with the slides and with a link to this spreadsheet and some more information there. So wanted to highlight that. Also, at the end here, I do mention that you can sign up for our newsletter if you would like to receive regular monthly updates on various things related to housing across the state, but also policy in general too. And we also send out calls to action for more opportunities like that. I wanted to mention some bills that did not quite make it this session, but we made a lot of progress on. Some of our partners made a lot of progress on, and will likely continue to work on in the future. So I'll highlight a few of the ones that were VHA's, our top priorities, and share a little background on them. And then I want to mention a few that I think you all might be familiar with that I can provide some more information on too quickly. So our top two priorities that we worked on this year at VHA was a bill introduced by Delegate Bennett Parker related to affordable housing preservation. Essentially, it would have allowed given localities the authority, if they chose to establish a right of first refusal during the sale of multifamily publicly subsidized properties that are at risk of losing affordability or like at the end of their affordability restrictions approaching expiration. We made quite a lot of progress. This is the first year that this was introduced, and it passed both the House and the Senate. Unfortunately, it was vetoed by the governor, but as I said, we made quite a lot of progress on this and are excited to continue conversations about affordable housing preservation. Because I know in Northern Virginia, you all have some right of first refusals baked into kind of local funds and local trust funds. I know we looked towards Prince George's County in Maryland kind of as an example of this. So there's quite a lot of various efforts around preservation that we want to continue. And if anyone is interested in having those conversations, please reach out to me. The second one is a bill that we're going to be continuing to work on in the Housing Commission. It was sent to the Housing Commission. Delegate Coiner introduced it. And we introduced this bill in an attempt to try to address some issues where we have several examples of affordable housing providers who have been taxed inaccurately. They've received inaccurate property tax assessments that aren't fully considering the income of that property. So in a lot of ways, they're being treated similar to a market rate property, even though the amount of income that they can receive from that property is lower because of rent restrictions. This doesn't always happen. There are a lot of tax assessors doing this correctly. But we were attempting to try to clarify some aspects in our current code that make it seem like it's optional to consider income and try to figure out ways to ensure that that does happen. There's still a lot of work to be done on this, but if you are, again, interested in this, would love to talk to you. We're going to be, it's sent to the Housing Commission and will be debated there. We are also working on, we've been working on bills that have actually been introduced for several years now related to inclusionary zoning programs, which or affordable dwelling unit ordinances, which I know many in Northern Virginia are very familiar with these. But basically, in a bill that was trying to give all localities the ability to do the full flexibility and full authority for those that Fairfax and Arlington and Alexandria have. It passed out of both chambers, and we made significant progress within housing stakeholders and discussions and trying to resolve some concerns. It was eventually vetoed by the governor, but again, we made significant progress, I say, just in trying to brainstorm and problem solve this, and we'll be continuing work too in the off season. I also wanted to mention two kind of funding items that weren't included in the budget. VHA has been working for a couple years now on trying to set up a pilot for a statewide state rental assistance program to supplement the Housing Tourist Voucher Program. And specifically, we've set this up as a pilot called the 5,000 Families Program. Essentially, it would provide be enough money to provide rental assistance to 5,000 low-income families with school-age children. And specifically, we targeted this group because we really want to highlight how housing is, housing stability is more than just like a housing intervention, that's also an education intervention, a healthcare intervention, and really highlighting the ways that housing instability impacts a student's ability to go to school, achieve their, have the same educational achievements, and be able to learn, as well as many other aspects, too. So I wanted to mention that, as well as a fund introduced by Delegate Carr that would kind of set up some incentives for localities to adopt more ordinances, policies that encourage affordable housing, affordable and diverse housing. So kind of trying to provide incentives to do things like allow accessory dwelling units by right, for example, or pass an affordable dwelling unit ordinance, or reduce some exclusionary zoning issues. It was not funded, but there are efforts to continue. We're getting close to when I need to change to questions, but I did want to mention these last bills here that might be on your mind as well to talk about. In particular, there were some exciting bills that were introduced related to kind of zoning, and that were introduced kind of by our partner, the Commonwealth Housing Coalition, that we worked with. One in particular called the Faith in Housing Act, that was proposing to allow religious organizations to build affordable housing by right, that they wouldn't have to go through a special permitting process if they were planning to build affordable housing. Very interesting. It was sent to the Housing Commission, and there are continuing conversations about this. It was the first year it was introduced here in Virginia, but considerable progress was made, and a lot of people are interested in that. As well as a bill that has been introduced now. This was, I think, the second year, but to allow accessory dwelling unit ordinance or dwelling units by right across Virginia. So it's saying that they don't also have to go through a special permitting process. And kind of in a lot of ways, this received quite a lot of opposition because it's kind of removing, and a lot of localities saw it as a way of removing their ability to regulate accessory dwelling units, which is not entirely true. The bill had a lot of detail and a lot of provisions that protected localities' ability to ensure that, it didn't put too much burden on infrastructure and things like that. But they were not able to reach agreement quite yet. It was sent to the Housing Commission again. There's going to be a lot of conversations, a lot of work on that, and we'll likely continue to come back until we're able to find some sort of solution that works for local governments, but also allows for more flexible housing, that can benefit. It has many different benefits, but I'm running out of time to go into those in particular. I'll also mention that there was a bill that was going to require affordable housing providers to follow a criminal background screening policy that, according to HUD standards of fair housing guidance, that was really great. Again, it was vetoed, but we've made progress on that as well. And then another bill introduced by Delegate Price that she's introduced for the past couple of years, basically trying to extend the pay or quit period for tenants when they're potentially facing eviction, they haven't paid rent, that they have 14 days before an eviction case can be filed after they haven't paid rent, instead of just 5, giving them actually enough time to maybe get a paycheck to then prevent that whole process from starting. It was passed, but then was vetoed by the governor as well. Alrighty. I guess last thing is, if you're curious about more detail for any of the things I mentioned, or want to see, what other bills might be related to housing as well, I recommend you check out our website. We have kind of a legislative tracker and a budget tracker that includes the vast majority of any sort of housing adjacent bills. If you want to look kind of more through them and see details about how far they made it and things like that. But that is everything. My email is here. If you want to reach out to me, would love to chat with any of you more, but want to make time for questions.
I wanted to say thank you, Isabel, very much for a very comprehensive presentation. I think you were able to touch on a lot of different topics that might be of interest to the different folks on the call. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, and we have almost 15 minutes for questions. We do have some that were already submitted. I just thought I'd ask, this one is a clarifying question, just if you could explain briefly about what happens when a bill goes to the Virginia Housing Commission. Someone wanted to know if it was a legislative subcommittee.
Yes, thank you so much for asking that. I did not provide enough detail on that. So the Virginia Housing Commission is sort of a work group set up to meet outside of the General Assembly, made up of legislators and some government appointees that it's specifically run by some staff as well, and the purpose is to study housing issues that we didn't have time to study during the General Assembly, and then do that throughout the year, and then hopefully present some recommendations for the General Assembly bills that they endorse that they can say, we studied this a lot. Yeah, here's what we recommend. They do have various work groups that they kind of divide into to study the different bills that are sent there. But it is not a legislative subcommittee in the sense that they are not going to pass any of these bills. And it's also not quite the setting of a bill hearing. It's more of a discussion. They have stakeholders that, like different housing stakeholders, that they appoint to different work groups too, so that those can be at the table to talk through some of these issues. They have lots of presentations come. There are a lot of conversations that still happen behind the scenes, I think, in the Housing Commission as well. But the work group meetings and the full meetings are open to the public, and they do have space for testimony. But kind of how it is set up is more of like a discussion. And even then, sometimes issues are too big for them to come to figure out something in just that year. So I will say, in my experience of here and being in Virginia, I think they've endorsed a couple bills every year, but not too many. Sometimes like this year, they got quite a few bills sent to the Housing Commission, and I don't really think there's any way that they can find solutions for all of them. So sometimes people can get disappointed when their bill is sent to the Housing Commission, because it may be kind of a nicer way to kill it and say, oh, we just need to study it some more. But at the same time, if people aren't ready and have a solution for it, the Housing Commission is supposed to be the body to study it. So it's kind of on us to make sure that it does stay a priority in the Housing Commission and that we are really able to dive deep into it.
Thank you.
They have a website too. I can put that in the chat. That includes, it has a calendar for their meetings. There's also, this is a link to all of the bills that were sent to them this General Assembly.
And it sounds like there is an opportunity for a little bit more active advocacy with the folks on that commission than maybe in the past.
Yeah, I think so.
The information we'll send, you've put in here, and then tomorrow or this week when we send our information, those will be there too if folks want to be in touch with those commissioners, or trying to track a little bit more closely to see if things might actually come back out of that study group. Someone was asking you if there's still time for the General Assembly to override any of the vetoes, and is it worth advocating for any of the bills that the governor did veto at this point?
Well, I will say, just to kind of the partisan nature of our legislature right now, with having a Democrat-led House and Senate and a Republican governor, and the majorities are slim, so Democrats do not have enough of a majority to override his vetoes, and they're not likely to get many Republicans to vote with them to override a veto. It's not very likely, at least I know for sure for these housing bills, it is not very likely at all that they will be able to override a veto. I'm not familiar with several other items, or the rest of the vetoes just in general. But it would be pretty difficult just based on how it's set up right now. But I mean, I never want to tell someone it's not worth advocating for something that you feel passionate about, just as long as it's like staying in the conversation, letting someone know that you wish it wasn't vetoed. It still can be helpful, but I will say that it's not very realistic that any of those vetoes will be overrode, and most of them were already considered in the reconvened session and not successfully overridden.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. So I have a couple more sort of logistical questions and then some more substantive ones. Someone was asking about, oh geez, I lost that question. All right, well, we'll move on to the two that came at the bottom. Okay, So someone was asking about the accessory dwelling unit ordinance that did not pass, and whether, how disappointing that was for folks, and what people might be able to do to help pressure him to potentially sign it next year. And that kind of overlaps with another question we got earlier, or prior to this, which was asking you what your maybe top 2 or 3 priorities, legislative priorities, will be from VHA's perspective in the coming session.
Yeah, definitely. I will say that it is a little bit confusing that there are 2 bills related that are called ADUs, the accessory dwelling unit ordinances and the affordable dwelling. Or oh wait, sorry, I messed it up. Wow, accessory dwelling unit is like the kind of like the granny flat, and then the affordable dwelling unit ordinance is like the inclusionary zoning. So I do want to clarify both of those. Unfortunately, disappointing that the affordable dwelling unit one was vetoed, and that the accessory dwelling one did not make it out. But I do think that we made significant progress on both of those. Especially the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, there were so many kind of like amendments and rewrites and so many conversations that really resolved several concerns, not all of them, but there was definitely some progress there. And then the same with the inclusionary zoning bill. We really had all the stakeholders at the table to really talk through what has worked, why localities may want the same authority that, Fairfax and Loudoun and Arlington, et cetera, have. And how we can do it in a way that like home builders and housing developers feel okay with, everywhere, and ensure that this could be done effectively, because inclusionary zoning can be done in a way that's not great, as is most programs. You have to find best practices. So I would say for what we can do to pressure him to sign those, or the governor, I'm not sure if we would be able to convince him necessarily to change his mind totally about inclusionary zoning, but if we were able to get some Republicans to support it, if we were able to talk through kind of why it is beneficial, and if the home builders and affordable home developers or developers were on board and were advocating for it as well, I think that there is a chance that we could get some Republican support and potentially sway the governor to not veto it again next year. As far as the accessory dwelling unit, because I'm not entirely sure which one you're asking for that one, I think that we'll kind of see what happens in the Housing Commission. I'm really hoping that a lot of work can be done to come up with a good bill for next session, and we will not know how the governor responds to it. But if they're able to get Republican support on that, then it might not be something that will be a quick veto. But I will say for our priorities for next year, there's a lot on the table. Most of the things I mentioned that, the honorable mentions will be things that we'll work on for next year to keep making progress on, even if we're not able to necessarily change the governor's mind, still making progress towards future years, and keeping those things in the minds and in the conversations that are had in the General Assembly. The only additional thing that I didn't mention is that we also will be working on extending our state housing tax credit that we have. It's set to expire at the end of next year. So next General Assembly will be working on extending that, and talking through any potential reforms to make it better or not. But that is something else that was not mentioned that will be new, that we'll be working on next year if you're interested. But again, the preservation, 5,000 families, tax assessment, some of those things we're going to continue working on.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. So just as a quick follow-up, Michael Schuster has noted in here that the Housing Commission will be addressing the ADUs on the 20th of May, and that's a live stream meeting. So if folks want to tune in, they can. And
Thank
then
you.
I think we have time for sorry?
Oh, I was just saying thank you for putting that in the chat.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. A couple quick ones, and then I think we have to wrap up, even though there's so much to touch on. Let's see. They were asking about the Community Opportunity Program, the tax credits, and what type of tax credits are available to landlords who might be willing to rent to voucher holders.
Yeah. So I know that it is set up kind of as an annual state tax credit. I don't know the exact, like, the limit, but I think I think it maybe I could be totally wrong, but this number is coming to my mind. I think it's like 10,000 is the top, but maybe less than that. But it's a certain amount of tax credit that you could be eligible for if you can provide evidence that you've rented to a housing choice voucher in an area of opportunity, a housing choice voucher holder in an area of opportunity.
Okay.
A lot of housing choice provider like administrators, like public housing authorities, really try to get information out about this and communicate to landlords about it and try to help them get on board and can support landlords in making sure that they get this tax credit. But it is a big expansion this year. And as I mentioned, trying to also target rural areas more. So I'm not entirely sure how the information will get out or exactly the process of getting that.
Yeah.
But definitely reach out to DHCD. They have a website kind of all about this, and you can get some more information.
Okay, and very quickly, we do have a lot of interest in the Reggie program. And there's a question about how much money is still in those funds that could be allocated to energy efficiency improvements for low-income households. Do you happen to know?
So I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I know that this is a little bit, I always feel a little bit unsure about this just because of the unpredictable nature about how long we will have Reggie, the efforts to try to remove us from Reggie, and at what point then do the funds stop. I do know that there is a considerable amount of funds that is unallocated that the General Assembly has to, basically that comes from the Reggie that then they have to administer to the different programs that it's supposed to do. I didn't realize that they had the authority to also like take a little bit out and put it towards this down payment assistance program or towards a manufactured home park or acquisition fund. So that was something new that I didn't quite expect and is not as directly related to energy efficiency. I think that there's some arguments that you can make, but it was definitely unexpected because I know that the purpose of Reggie is for energy efficiency, weatherization. But as far as what I know from DHCD for specifically like the high E funds that are from Reggie for specifically energy efficiency improvements and inclusion in new affordable housing developments, that there are still funds and they will be getting more funds, but I just don't know when that ends or exactly how much. So,
Sure. Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. I know there are folks who had additional questions, but thank you so much, Isabella from VHA, for being with us today and for all of you for spending an hour with us.